The following was recorded in front of a live studio audience at the Studio 21 Podcast Cafe. This is the United Podcast Network.
Want to shake up your small business marketing? I mean, really shake it up.
Studio 21 Podcast Cafe.
Have you been thinking about doing your own podcast?
Studio 21 Podcast Cafe.
Would you like to take your business to the next level?
Studio 21 Podcast Cafe.
This is the golden age of podcasting, and it's time to stop thinking and start doing.
Studio 21 Podcast Cafe.
Get your message heard 24/7, 365, over and over again.
Studio 21 Podcast Cafe.
Welcome to the 21st century.
Welcome to the Studio 21 Podcast Cafe.
Here's the creator and host of the Studio 21 Podcast Cafe, David Garofalo.
Welcome, everybody, to the Studio 21 Podcast Cafe. This is a 21-minute or less weekly podcast to help you get your message out, grow your business, and build your bottom line. Let me help you bring your marketing and advertising into the 21st century. My name is David Garofalo. I've been doing podcasting since 2010 and created a six-figure income from my podcast alone. It's a 21-minute podcast or less, so let's start the clock and let's begin. Today, the intro, the introduction. Those that are listening for the first time, you hear the introduction on the show. Those that have listened to the show many times never heard an intro to the show before. And as I was planning my notes here for the show, I said, we don't even have an intro for the show. So this is the first week the introduction is there. So how we did it before is we eased a little music into the show. That's how it started off. A little music came, and I kind of introduced myself. Now we have created an intro, so I don't have to do that. It sounds a little more professional. That some intro ends up happening, so that's what we're looking to do. We could add the host doing the introduction, which is what I would do in the past, but it seemed a little awkward, me introducing myself. So the new introduction can explain the podcast, what it's all about, and that's what you heard in there. And it might paint a picture, if this is the first time you're listening to the show, you, the listener, what the show was all about. So kind of sets the mood for what the show is. The type of music that's used, the pace that's happening on the intro, all of it matters when you're putting an intro together. So what should you do and how should you be doing it? First, think of it over and over again of what your show is all about and write a script for that you want to say, to get that message out that you want to say at the beginning of the show. Next, add some, and let me put this in quotes, royalty-free music. And it must be royalty-free music, because if it isn't, you're going to pay the price later on. You're not going to get the search engine optimization. You're not going to get out there on certain places. They're going to take you down, and it's going to be a big mistake. So royalty-free music, we've talked about this in past podcasts. Go out there and find it. Or some sound effects. You'll hear all these things today. The idea is make it your own. Make that intro your own intro. This is not the Johnny Carson show, so it doesn't have to be that. If you want to steal little ideas and things like that, but try to make the intro that it's your own intro, and maybe that catches on someday and people hear that intro and realize that it's your show. Be sure to include the podcast name. I've heard it missing on some intros of people's shows. They don't even mention it. Quite the opposite when you just heard the intro to the Studio 21 Podcast Cafe. We said it over and over again in between each sentence that the girl said, the man comes on and says Studio 21 Podcast Cafe. We want to drill it into your head. We want it to become natural to you that you hear Studio 21 or Studio anything, it's going to come Studio 21 Podcast Cafe. We're trying to drill it in your mind. That's part of the reason behind that. Remember, they could be listening for a year or even 2 years from now, the show that you're doing now. So don't paint yourself in a corner when you do it. Something that's really happening right now and may be a year from now nobody even knows. You throw in dilly dilly or something like that, and a year from now nobody even knows what that's all about or what that was ever all about. So be aware of the current event things or dating anything, because this show should hopefully, your show that you do, should hopefully live on forever and ever. Make it grand if that's what you want. You want a grand entrance into this thing, but not so grand that when you arrive, it's actually a letdown. So if it's a grand entrance and then you walk in and, hey, yeah, that's me, whatever, really seems odd. You're going to try to pace it the way your show is paced. Include your disclaimer if needed. If you need a disclaimer, say a licensing number. If you're in a business that you have to report your licensing number on every show, you might as well put it in the intro, because if you forget, it's automatically there and planted. So anything that you may forget that's important for you, you can put that into the intro or the outro of the show. The outro of the show is a whole different thing. Today we're talking about intros. And give the listener a quick synopsis of the show. And that's what you heard in the beginning of our intro, that we said, this is what we do and why we do it. And I'm teaching you about podcasting. So how long should the intro be? My thought is between 30 and 45 seconds is more than enough to introduce what the show is going to be all about. Now, whose voice should you use? I'm guessing not yours. They're going to be hearing you for the next 30 minutes or however how long your podcast is. It doesn't need to be yours. If you wanted to throw a little bit of yours in it, some clips from some old shows, assuming you're doing podcasting already and now you're learning to do an intro, you want to add it. We did all our shows before we started our intro today. I certainly could have put clips of myself saying something. I think it would go better if this was a show where there was banter back and forth and there were two people talking or arguing or complaining or something like that, showing that. Me by myself, I thought, no need of it. You're going to be hearing me for the next 21 minutes, so there's no need. As I say, odd to introduce yourself anyway. Get a pro, the right voice. There's a company out there called Fiverr, and you can pay between $5 and, say, $20 for a voiceover person. You send them the script, and they send it to you complete. All those words are complete exactly with the voice you chose, and you can listen to the different voices and accents and tones of the voices. There's Voice Jungle out there, $60 for 60 seconds, basically $1 a second. Voices.com, you have 200,000 voice actors that are on that platform, so you can find the exact right person you're looking for there. You can pick the accents, the language. It's pretty cool. Check them out. We've done here at the Studio 21 Podcast Cafe a bunch of podcasts for other people. And a lot of the times they ask us to actually do their work for them, which is part of what we offer. And they want the introduction, the intro to their show. And we've done it all kinds of different ways. What I do is I write the script, send it to them, make sure that they're okay with this is what I think the show is all about. If they want to change anything, let me know. Then we go out looking for the right voice for it. We get that back. Now we have the underlining voice and the tempo basically of how we want to lay it out. We have the, now we're going to look for the sound bed to go behind it, some royalty-free music, and that can get tricky a little bit. You don't want a vibrant type of sound to a somber type of podcast and the other way around. Maybe you want to add some sound effects. Maybe we do, and you're going to hear some of these things. Sounds are easier than that. I mean, not a lot of royalty on the sound effects. But if you've never done it before, this could be tricky. There's plenty of people that can do it for you. They can do it all for you, just like we can here on Studio 21 Podcast Cafe. I want to play for you today 7 intros that we created. And they are all very different than each other, but might give you a good idea of what kind you want for your podcast and how to do it at the same time. So I'm going to do that for you in just 1 minute. But first, do you know about Studio 21 Podcast Cafe? Not the podcast, but the place. Well, if you don't, you haven't heard this.
If you're in the area of Boston North into southern New Hampshire and you're thinking about doing a podcast, there is a place you have to see. It's called Studio 21 Podcast Cafe. Located right over the border into Salem, New Hampshire, Studio 21 Podcast Cafe is a live, working, full-service podcast and vodcast, that's video on demand, studio. All professional equipment, professional producer, and total distribution of your podcast is done for you. Would you like search engine optimization for more people to find your business or better ranking on Google? Well, Studio 21 Podcast Cafe can do it all for you for far less than you think. Schedule a free 21-minute no-obligation consultation by going to www.studio21podcast.cafe. That's studio21podcast.cafe. Now, back to the program.
And we are back, and today we're talking about the podcast intro, the introduction to your podcast, the sound effect or the words that are going to happen before your show starts. We're going to be going to be careful to use royalty-free music, right? That's what you're going to do is make sure you're careful. If you have sounds that are in there, music that's in there, you're going to be careful to make sure it's royalty-free because that's going to really hold you up if you don't. You're going to write the script, and you're going to include any critical information, including the host introduction. Introduce the host and the theme of the show. And you're going to pick a voice, the right voice that'll be right for the show. But before you do all that, what do you want the introduction to sound like? Happy and party-like? Do you want it to be somber? Do you want a woman's voice or a man's voice? How about special effects, sound effects? Clips from the show. I have 7 podcast introductions here, and I want you to listen to them. We'll go through them one at a time, and maybe this will help you decide what you like. Is it the fun one? Is it the one with the jingle? How about the calm one that eases into a touchy subject? The exciting one? How about the one with the female voice? Or how about the male voice? Or the one with the accent? You decide. It's your podcast, and the sky's the limit. Maybe listening to another person's intro and podcast will help you decide. We'll see. The first one is a bit over 30 seconds long. Nice time, by the way. I'm telling you, between 30 and 45 seconds is more than enough. And it starts with an attention grabber, a knock. And that's how they get your attention. A young woman's voice will come on. Let's give you now the Don't Do It Yourself podcast introduction. Let's give it a listen.
Put that hammer down. This is the Don't Do It Yourself podcast.
Don't take the risk.
The New England Contractors Referral podcast that begs you, the homeowner, to put that hammer down and get the referral of a ready, reputable contractor from your host.
Our motto is put the hammer down.
No nonsense, Nance.
That's what we're here for.
And Tommy Two
You
Shoes.
can't get a word in edgewise with a
Well,
woman
not with a
anyway,
woman,
you know
that's
that.
right.
Join us as they guide you through the maze and refer you to the right man or woman for the job.
Right now, I'm at Studio 21 Podcast Cafe.
This is the Don't Do It Yourself podcast. Here's Tommy.
Okay, and that's when Tommy jumps in. So you heard the attention grabber at the beginning, the knock, knock, knock. The young woman's voice comes in. Maybe she's the stay-at-home mom, right? Can you picture her as the right age for that? That should be the one that would be, because this is a home referral, somebody that is looking for somebody to maybe fix their roof and things like that, an Angie's List type of thing of a podcast. Then she introduces the host, and then you hear the host voices in the introduction also. They go back and forth. There's a man and a woman on there. Tommy and Nance, they go back and forth and have introduced themselves within that. And when you do end up hearing them, you've kind of been introduced to them already, even if it's the first time you're listening to it. They even mention the Studio 21 Podcast Cafe on their introduction of the podcast. How nice. I talked to them about it. They wanted it to be professional and cover all their bases, including where it was recorded. So as opposed to being recorded in their basement or in a closet, it's a real studio, and they wanted that to be known that they're legitimate. They're a professional company. So here's Tommy, is how it ends, and there's a little bit of the Johnny Carson thing right there, right? Here's Tommy and it brings him right up to the host, and that's where he takes on. So great job on that intro of that show, and that's kind of how the show goes. If you listen to that show, it's the Don't Do It Yourself podcast, and give it a listen, and you'll hear that intro each and every time on the show. Next up, let's listen to number 2. Actually, the same female voice you're going to hear on this, but it's a totally different inflection and tone on her voice. This podcast is called The Friends in Recovery, and it's about recovering to addiction. So this is no joke. This is a serious, serious matter. Again, the same exact person, but you'll hear the different calming and serious tone in her voice. Also different in the intro is the mention of the advertiser and the sponsor of the show that they added to the introduction. They didn't want to forget that, so they actually put it in right at their intro. They'll never forget it. That's how the show starts. And they also added within their intro the ask, asking you, the subscriber, to subscribe to their show. Right from the start, there it is right on the show. And it's very important. We want you to do it here on the Studio 21 Podcast Cafe, and sometime during the show we're asking you to subscribe. They actually put it right in there. So they took care of a lot of bases right off the beginning. This show saves lives, and it takes care of business right from the start. So let's give a listen to the intro of the Friends in Recovery podcast.
Welcome to the Friends in Recovery podcast, the podcast that is here to help you, a loved one, or a friend get started down the road to recovery. This is the Friends in Recovery podcast, brought to you by the Genesis House. Genesis House, providing a safe, nurturing environment to heal from addiction since 1992. Please be a friend and share our message with a friend on Podbean, iTunes, iHeartRadio, or YouTube. And now, here are your Friends in Recovery.
Did you hear the difference there, right? Same person, same length of time, but the intro very, very different. What is the right way to do your podcast? As you're listening to this, you can make that decision, right? You're hearing the different things that are there, and you heard all the things that they included at the very beginning, things that you heard about on this show that needs to be added to your podcast. They listened to it too. They took it serious, and they put it into their show. So here's another one, number 3. Very different than both of those that you heard already. This one is the jingle. It's a fun show that's more like a party. And the intro seems just like that, so it's the perfect one for them. The show is called the Real Estate House Party Podcast, and you know it's fun right from the intro, so let's give it a listen.
If you're planning on buying or selling a home, the Real Estate Crew's got news for you at the Real Estate House Party.
With attorney Rick Carter,
Real Estate House Party.
paralegal Kathy Holsthausen,
Real Estate House Party. Come in, have fun.
and comedian Tony V. Now, here's real estate attorney Rick Carter.
All right, so there's something different there, right? There is the jingle of the show. It sounds like a party. It is a party. They have a comedian on there. They laugh and joke, but they're doing business at the same time. But that's part of their show. They call it the Real Estate House Party. It's a party, and it should sound like a party, and it does. That's the idea, so try to keep it the way it's going, the way it's supposed to go. You don't want to confuse the people. Imagine having that one with the girl on there in a somber mood, and then they come on like a party. I mean, it wouldn't match up. Neither would it go the other way around. So we've heard a woman's vocal. We've heard a jingle. Now let's hear a man's voice without a jingle. This one is the political podcast where brother and sister battle like fighters to get their opinion across to each other. Special effects, including bells and a crowd roaring in the background, helps paint the picture of a prize fight. The show is called Political TNT, and it's just like that. So here's the introduction to Political TNT.
In the blue corner, weighing in at a slim and trim 215 pounds, Tom Troy. And in the red corner, weighing in at none of your goddamn business, Nancy Troy. Brother versus sister, Democrat versus Republican, left versus right. It's family politics. This is Political TNT with Tom and Nancy Troy.
Okay, and that's when they jump in and start talking, and it's much like that. I mean, you heard the type of music that's playing there, and here they are walking down the ring, basically going to fight. Right? It's a battle that's going to happen, and that's just what you get—a battle within that show. It's called Political TNT, and give that show a listen to. And a very interesting show, and very different than the other ones you saw there, and it sounds different because it is different. Next up is a podcast of woman book writers, and they actually chose a man as their introduction, as their three women that are on the show. So they introducing a man's voice to actually introduce them, not to confuse their voice with maybe the female that would be introducing them. So they put a male's voice instead of this. So very different podcast. This is book writers. Let's see if it works on the Writer's Block podcast.
Welcome to the Writer's Block Podcast NH. This is a podcast designed by writers for writers on the journey to being published. Joined Mandra Biscornet.
It was so healthy and nutritious.
Deborah Monk.
Can we open each podcast with a dance number?
Shelley Devlin.
It was so full of inspiration and sparkles.
Every Tuesday morning live on YouTube, and make sure you subscribe to catch the podcast anytime on iTunes, iHeartRadio, Podbean, Spotify, or your favorite podcast catcher. It's time to be inspired, feel empowered, and be well with the Writer's Block Podcast NH.
And there they go, the Writer's Block Podcast. So a little different than the other ones you heard there, and we're going to continue on. The girls made sure in their intro that they included the ask, right? You heard it. And they asked you to subscribe. And they'll never forget it ever again because it's in there. Maybe they'll ask more often, but it's already in their introduction. And also where to find it, right? They mentioned that you can actually see it on YouTube. And then they're off to the show. Once that intro is there, they've taken care of business and they're off to the show. Next up is something you should be very careful of, which is using a voice of someone with an accent. And I say don't do it, right? Don't use an accent because it maybe make people uncomfortable that that's not where they're from, and they hear it and it's bothersome. And that is unless you're doing it for a certain reason. The next podcast intro, you will hear yours truly doing the voiceover, including my terrible New England accent. But the podcaster, the Easy Money New England podcast, asked for it. That's what they wanted. Where New England is right there in the name and the title of the show, the owner was more than okay with it and wanted it. The show is Easy Money New England, and you'll notice some Rodney Dangerfield lines from the movie Easy Money thrown in just for fun. So here's the intro to Easy Money New England. Welcome to Easy Money New England.
Oh, can somebody help us here?
We can, because we are real estate and mortgage professionals.
Where you go? It says come in and browse.
That's right. Come on in, listen up and learn.
How long do you intend to browse?
In a short period of time, our panel will teach you some tricks that might make your house buying easier.
You don't ask her how long she intends to browse.
You might not be looking for a mortgage today, but we'll get you ready.
You don't look like browsers.
Are you looking?
No, what do browsers look like?
Yeah, maybe I'm half browse.
On his father's side.
This is Easy Money New England.
Let's show the lady we're browsers.
With your host, Brian D'Amico.
Hey, look at us, we're browsers. One more word out of you and he gets it, all right? Come on.
And I know we're going a little over today. These are intros, so by playing each one of these intros, it's adding up to the time. I'm sorry for that. But the last one I want you to hear, I need you to hear, is on my own podcast called The Cigar Authority. It's a little too long if you ask me. Again, I learned as years went on. I've been doing this podcast for more than 8 years now, maybe about 15 seconds too long. But the show is actually too long also. It's a 2-hour show every week. So that's a mistake too, but again, I didn't know what I was doing. Now I know better. I'm going to have to make it shorter someday, but right now this is the way it is. Wake up to the show is what we're trying to do. The show is starting. I'm trying to wake you up and let everybody know the show's ready to start. So let's listen to the intro of the Cigar Authority.
I got a fever, and the only prescription is over the line!
This
I'm sorry, Smokey. You were over the line. That's a foul.
is the Cigar Authority.
Is it true that if you don't use it, you lose it?
The Authority.
Is that a serious question?
On everything cigar.
No, it wasn't.
In.
It's like I picked the wrong week to quit smoking.
And out of the cigar industry.
Sounds pretty awesome.
With your host.
You have to use so many cuss words.
David Garofalo.
Whenever I'm about to do something, I think, would an idiot do that? And if they would, I do not do that thing.
Mr. Jonathan.
Check out the name tag. You're in my world now, Grandma.
Barry Stein.
Put the scotch on the rocks. Any scotch will do, as long as it's not a blend, of course. Single malt. Glenlivet, Glenfiddich, perhaps, maybe even Glengow, any Glen.
It's time to light 'em up.
Sounds really fun.
It's time.
Cool.
Cool.
For the Cigar Authority.
I gotta have more cowbell.
Okay, then the party begins, right? So I woke everybody up, let them know the show's going to be there, and then we sit there and light cigars and relax. Maybe a little too vibrant on it again, but this is, as I'm learning, we can change it, right? You're not stuck with your intro. As years went on, we actually have changed the intro as it goes on. If I was to do it again, who knows what ends up happening. You live and learn as you go on. But right now, to wrap it up, the intro to your podcast can say a lot about your show. It gets your listeners prepared for what's coming. You can add stuff, but you can never forget that they can't forget your licensing number, things like that that you have to have on there. So don't forget to do it. If it's needed, why not? That's the way you put it. And the all-important ask. You heard it in a lot of their podcasts. They already have it in there. They put it in there. It's awesome. Have it set the tone for your show. If you want to talk to me about doing this or doing a podcast, message me at the Contact Us button at the Studio21podcast.cafe. I'm going to say that website again because somebody said they tried to email me at the Studio21podcast.com, and it's not. It's the Studio21podcast.cafe. They have a .cafe, not .com. We thought it was good, so that's why we put it there, but confusing people. Studio21podcast.cafe. Set up a meeting with me and let me know that you want to come see the podcast studio. Let me know about your show. I'll even buy you a cup of coffee. Next week, we're going to talk about podcast SEO. That's search engine optimization. How are they going to find you? How are you going to get the search engines to bring you to the top so they can find you so you can be noticed? That's my 21 minutes or less. Today it was more, and we're out of here. You've been listening to the Studio 21 Podcast Cafe, live from the Studio 21 Podcast Cafe on the United Podcast Network.
The views and opinions expressed by the hosts, guests, or callers of this program do not necessarily reflect the opinions of the Studio 21 Podcast Cafe, the United Podcast Network, its partners, or affiliates.